It was a mild October morning when the village of Little Brimley awoke to something it hadn't seen in decades. A crime scene. The Holloways' home, a neat cottage tucked behind a thicket of birch trees, sat in eerie silence. The door was ajar, yet nothing seemed disturbed from the outside, no broken glass, no signs of struggle. But inside, in the parlour, Henry Holloway lay dead, slumped beside the writing desk, his spectacles still hanging from one ear. A single clean blow to the back of the head had ended him. No weapon was found. Nothing of value was missing. And, perhaps most puzzling of all, a child's drawing lay neatly on the carpet near his hand. Pencil on crumpled white paper. A crude sketch of a stick figure lying in a pool of what appeared to be red crayon. Another figure standing nearby with a club-shaped object. It was Geraldine, the housekeeper, who found him. She'd arrived just after 7 to begin her routine, expecting to open windows and sweep the hearth. Instead, she fled down the lane, screaming. By 8, Inspector Cray from the county had arrived with his men, but by noon the house was still taped off, and the questions only grew. Henry Holloway had lived alone since his wife passed years earlier. No children, no close friends. He was retired, formerly a solicitor in London who'd chosen Little Brimley for peace. That peace was now ruptured. The cottage windows reflected only blue sky and quiet hedges, but within, the air was thick with confusion. The police scoured the premises. There was no sign of forced entry. The back door was locked from the inside. All windows were latched. Only the front door stood open, but Holloway had been found inside, not near it. The time of death was estimated to be around 5 in the morning. Geraldine, tear-streaked and shaking, insisted she had locked up everything as always the night before. Nothing made sense. Then there was the drawing. It had no signature, but it looked like the sort of scribble a child might produce. The officers dismissed it as unrelated, a discarded paper. Others weren't so sure. It showed a specific scene, not just random violence. It felt deliberate. And yet, there were no children in Henry Holloway's life. The man had never even welcomed trick-or-treaters. His neighbours described him as polite but distant. He took solitary walks, never hosted guests, and subscribed to the Times. Still, the image lingered. It reached Miss Marple by tea-time, delivered by Mrs. Draycott, who always made it her business to bring news, whether asked for or not. They say the poor man was bludgeoned, and get this, there was a drawing, Jane, a child's drawing with a body and blood, and the whole thing quite gruesome. Miss Marple blinked behind her knitting. A child's drawing? She repeated gently. Yes, no one knows where it came from. The old lady said nothing more until Mrs. Draycott left. Then she rose, wrapped a shawl about her shoulders, and walked slowly down the lane toward the Holloways' gate. She didn't enter, of course. The constable posted outside was firm about that, but she stood for a while watching the house, the windows, the garden path, the birch trees that trembled slightly in the breeze. It was 2 days before the police admitted they were stumped. Inspector Cray returned to interview the housekeeper again, combing through the smallest details. Henry's watch was still on, his wrist, his wallet untouched. His evening brandy glass stood on the sideboard, half full. The fireplace ashes revealed nothing but soot. No phone calls were made or received during the night. Yet someone had been in that house and left without a trace. The drawing remained the only anomaly. It had been sent to a forensic analyst, but results were slow to return. Meanwhile, whispers spread. who had drawn it, and why. It was Miss Marple, who suggested speaking to the children, not because they were suspects, but because children notice things adults don't. She took it upon herself to visit the school under the pretext of reading to the infants. It was there, as she read the Wind in the Willows, that she spotted little Danny Price. Danny was quiet, often alone, his shoes scuffed, his cuffs frayed. Miss Marple noticed his drawings, lined up along the classroom wall, each more vivid than the last. He had a habit of sketching moments from real life, exaggerated in a child's way. A fox by the bin, a cat on the school roof, a teacher with wild hair and a giant book. But there at the end of the row was something else. A house, a man inside it holding a stick. Another man lying down, red crayon smeared around him. Miss Marple asked the teacher casually about Danny. A bit odd, the woman said kindly. He lives with his uncle now, after his parents. Well, it was a rough patch. Keeps to himself, draws all the time. But there's no harm in him. When she gently asked Danny about his pictures, he didn't speak at first. Then he pointed to the birch trees. I saw from there, he said. She blinked. Saw what, dear? He just tapped the drawing and said, he hit the man. With the stick. Miss Marple's heart quickened, but her voice stayed calm. What sort of stick, Danny? A walking one, he said. It folded. She thanked him, left, and made her way straight to Inspector Cray. They checked the trees. And, sure enough, in the soft earth behind the trunks, they found small footprints, child-sized. The view through the window was clear enough to see the study inside, especially with the curtains half drawn. Miss Marple asked a quiet favour of Cray, search Holloway's things again, especially any canes, umbrellas, walking sticks. After hours of sifting, they found it. A heavy, foldable walking stick in a corner of the shed, its handle speckled with faint brown, overlooked before, now suddenly suspect. But why would someone use that, and how did Danny know? That, Miss Marple murmured, was the next piece to find. Because a child who sees too much often says too little, especially when frightened. But she was now certain the answer was not in the house, but in the village. In the people Henry Holloway had once called his clients, and perhaps in someone who had something to hide, and thought no one had seen a thing, except a child with a pencil. Miss Marple returned to her garden that evening, the late sun casting long shadows across the ivy-covered walls. Her mind, however, remained fixed on that child's drawing and the walking stick, foldable, heavy, capable of being tucked away without suspicion. She knew too well how easily such details could be missed by those not attuned to subtleties. She had seen it often, the difference between a rushed official conclusion and the quiet truth waiting patiently beneath the surface. The inspector was competent, no doubt, but already she had noticed his reliance on linear thinking. Locked doors, no forced entry, no theft, it all pointed to him toward a dead end. But Miss Marple had learned, over decades of life and loss and tea-room confessions, that people often overlooked what was placed right in front of them. She walked again to the Holloway house the next morning, this time invited by Inspector Cray, who was beginning to suspect that the old woman's insight might be more than idle village curiosity. She entered the study quietly, her eyes scanning not only the crime scene but the way the light hit the corners, the small grooves in the carpet, the discoloration on a brass knob. She made no remarks yet, just looked, while Cray offered updates. They've confirmed the time of death between 4 and 5, he said, arms crossed. No fingerprints on the stick, but the blood matches Holloway. It's the murder weapon, no doubt. and yet no one saw anyone enter. The place was locked up like a safe. Miss Marple bent slightly to inspect the skirting board beneath the writing desk. A small scrape, barely visible, as though something had been dragged. "The child, Danny Price, says he saw it from the trees," Cray continued. "We've spoken to his uncle, man named Colin Price. Works in deliveries, quiet sort. Moved here 2 years ago. Seems surprised by the boy's drawing, but doesn't deny it." Miss Marple looked up. Surprise is one thing. But did he seem alarmed? Cray paused. "You know, I couldn't quite tell." Miss Marple straightened. "Then perhaps you weren't meant to." She turned her attention to the mantel, where several framed photographs had been arranged. Most were faded, but one was strikingly new. A man in a suit, smiling awkwardly beside a beaming Holloway. She picked it up. "This isn't family, is it?" she asked. Cray looked. "That's Reginald Moore, estate agent. Helped Holloway with some property issues last year. Odd he'd keep it displayed." Miss Marple nodded. "Odd indeed, especially given the dust pattern beneath. It's been moved recently." She set it down carefully, then walked to the bookshelf, where a row of volumes stood too neatly aligned. Her fingers paused on the 8th, Book, the Law and the Public Trust, and she tilted it. Inside, tucked between the pages, was a small slip of paper, torn from a ledger. A note scribbled in haste. "Price, Brimley Cottages, 22 Octum, 3:15 p.m. She held it out to Cray. "Wouldn't you say that's rather specific?" He took it, frowning. "That's the day before the murder." "And the time suggests a meeting," Cray muttered under his breath. "Price is claiming he hadn't spoken to Holloway in months, just a neighbour." "Which is strange," Miss Marple said, "because he wasn't listed as a neighbour until last year, and the house he rents was once a legal holding in dispute between Holloway and an unnamed party." Cray blinked. "How do you know that?" "I overheard Mr. March at the post office last spring. He'd mentioned Holloway was dealing with a legal nuisance about property claims. It seemed dull at the time, now less so." Cray stared down at the paper again, the line of his jaw tightening. "I'll bring Price in for another talk." But Miss Marple wasn't finished. She gestured toward the fireplace. "One more thing. Inspector, that brandy glass. Has anyone checked to see if it was moved after the fact?" "It was only half full." "What of it?" "It suggests interruption. A man like Holloway finishes his evening routine. 1 glass, 2 sips, then sleep. To leave it there, untouched, suggests someone came while he was still alert. And look here." She leaned closer to the glass, careful not to touch it. "There's a faint ring beneath it, as though another glass had been placed, then taken." Cray's brow furrowed. "You're saying the killer stayed long enough to have a drink?" "No. I'm saying the killer may have shared a drink, under the pretense of civility." Cray was silent for a long moment. Then he exhaled slowly. "There's more going on than I thought. And less," Miss Marple said gently, "because the trick is often not in what's added, but what's taken away." As Cray made arrangements to call in Colin Price for deeper questioning, Miss Marple turned her attention to something else that had bothered her since the beginning. The boy's words, "He hit the man." With the stick. He hadn't said a man. He had said he, which suggested familiarity, a known figure, a person the boy could identify but feared to name. She returned to the school that afternoon, under the pretext of donating books. The children were outside during recess. Danny sat. "Apart drawing again, this time a house with birds above it, may I?" Miss Marple asked gently, kneeling beside him. Danny nodded without looking up. Your uncle must be very proud of your drawings. There was a pause. He doesn't look at them. Perhaps he's too busy. Danny looked up now, eyes wide, uncertain. He said I didn't see it. Miss Marple's heart gave a slow, heavy beat. Did he? Danny nodded again. He said people dream strange things. She kept her voice calm. But you didn't dream, did you? No. He leaned closer, whispering. He was angry. Mr. Holloway said something. Then the stick was fast, like this. He jabbed the air with his pencil. Then it was quiet. Then I ran. Miss Marple placed a hand gently over his. You've been very brave, Danny. But inside she already knew. It wasn't just a crime of impulse. It was the result of something unresolved. A tension, building in silence, until one early morning it broke, and only a child with a pencil bore witness. The deception had begun long before the murder, and now, piece by piece, it was unraveling. Colin Price arrived at the station just past noon, summoned politely but firmly by Inspector Cray. He came without resistance, his expression composed, even slightly confused as, though the invitation surprised him. He wore a worn grey coat and spoke in the careful tones of a man eager not to offend. Miss Marple was not present in the room, but she sat nearby, waiting to observe what came after. Cray, seated opposite, unfolded the note from Holloway's book and placed it on the table without preamble. Did you meet Mr. Holloway on the 2nd of October? Colin's brow furrowed. No, sir. I haven't spoken to him in months. He kept to himself, you know. Not unfriendly, just private. Cray pushed the note forward. He wrote this down, your name, your address. A time? Colin blinked at it, leaned forward as if uncertain, then gave a small laugh. Well, I don't know what that means. Maybe he was planning to come see me. Maybe he never did. But your nephew claims he saw you at the Holloway house the night Mr. Holloway was murdered. The reaction was slight, but there, a flicker around the eyes. Danny's just a boy. He sees things, dreams things. My sister's passing. It shook him. Danny saw the murder, Cray said bluntly, and his drawing, drawn before he could have known the details, matches the crime scene exactly. Colin straightened, suddenly defensive. He's a child. Children imagine things. Cray nodded slowly. So he imagined the foldable walking stick, the one found with blood on it. Colin didn't respond. He looked at the note again, then back at the inspector. I didn't kill anyone, he said. You need to believe that. We don't need belief, Mr. Price. We need the truth. After he was released, pending further inquiries, Colin walked out of the station in silence. Miss Marple watched him go, noting how stiffly he moved, not with the nervous energy of the guilty, but the rigid caution of someone guarding too many thoughts. She waited a few minutes, then rose to speak with Cray. He's hiding something, Cray said before she spoke, but I'm not sure it's murder, at least not yet. Miss Marple nodded. Did he mention his job? Delivery driver. Said he works long hours, no schedule, cash work, nothing firm to track. I would suggest, she said gently, that you ask about the delivery van he's been parking behind the abandoned stable at Brimley Lane. I believe he's been avoiding official routes. Cray looked up sharply. How do you know that? Because I walk every morning, and I see who hides what. Meanwhile, the next conversation took place in the garden of Mrs. Elsie Longworth, Holloway's nearest neighbour. A widow, soft-spoken, fond of chrysanthemums and quiet judgments. Cray questioned her, while Miss Marple sat beside her with folded hands. "I can't say I heard anything that night," she said. "I sleep with the windows shut. These old bones can't afford a chill." "Did you know Mr. Holloway well?" Cray asked. Elsie hesitated. "As well as one knows someone who never lets you in. He was kind enough, said good morning, but no visitors, no calls, never even asked for sugar." "Did you ever see Mr. Price visiting?" She tilted her head. "A few times, always brief. I assumed it was something legal, to do with rent or such. Mr. Holloway held the papers on several cottages. I heard that through the grocer." "And did you hear any arguments?" She looked at him directly, voice quieter now. "Yes. Once. Not shouting, but firm voices. Mr. Holloway was angry. Said something about documents. That was weeks ago." "Did you tell anyone?" She shrugged. "Didn't seem my place, I suppose. I should have." Cray made notes, then glanced at Miss Marple, who was eyeing the garden gate. "You're thinking something," he said quietly. "I'm thinking," she said, "that people rarely argue about documents unless something's been changed or hidden." Later that day they questioned Reginald Moore, the estate agent whose photograph had seemed oddly out of place. He arrived wearing too much cologne and offered his hand eagerly. "Awful business," he said, shaking his head. "Poor Mr. Holloway. Dreadful thing. You knew him well?" "We worked together last year. Land disputes, some property transitions, bit of red tape. Still in touch?" Moore smiled uneasily. "Not regularly. Maybe a card at Christmas." Cray leaned forward. "Your photo was on his mantel." Moore looked genuinely confused. "Was it? Must have left it during one of our meetings. Funny thing, isn't it? Why would a retired solicitor keep the photo of an estate agent?" Moore gave a short laugh. "Ego, maybe, or habit." Miss Marple watched him, tilting her head slightly. "And did you ever handle the sale of the Brimley cottages?" Moore paused. "Yes, actually. That was a few months ago. Holloway retained me to oversee it, but it was complicated. Tenants, old leases, forgotten paperwork." "Did Colin Price's name come up in those dealings?" she asked. Moore shifted slightly. "Not directly, but yes, I suppose it might have. He was pressing to purchase his cottage, if I recall. There was something off about the timing. Holloway said the lease had been tampered with." "Tampered how?" Cray asked. Moore sighed. Someone had backdated a renewal. Holloway suspected it had been altered to make Price seem a legal tenant when he wasn't. "And what did Mr. Holloway plan to do about it?" "He said he was going to bring it down on someone's head, I think." "He was furious." Cray nodded. "And yet you never reported any of this?" Moore raised his hands. "It wasn't my job to report threats. I deal in square footage and signatures." Miss Marple looked at him carefully. "And signatures, Mr. Moore, can be forged." That night, Cray sat with a growing pile of notes, each interview revealing a slightly different truth, each version brushing up against another until none quite matched. Colin Price claimed no contact. Mrs. Longworth had heard a dispute. Moore hinted at fraud but took no responsibility. And all the while the boy's drawing sat quietly on the desk. A scene not invented but witnessed. Miss Marple stood behind him, silent, watching. "Too many voices," Cray said softly. She nodded. "Yes. And the one that matters hasn't spoken yet. The boy." "No," she said. "The victim. We've heard what everyone thinks he did, or said. But what was he planning that made him dangerous? Cray stared ahead. You think Holloway uncovered something? I think he did, she replied, and I think someone silenced him before he could expose it. But they were rushed, and somewhere in all their panic, they left behind the thing they couldn't fake, the wrong version of the truth. And with that, the silence between their thoughts filled with only one thing: motive, quiet, urgent, and unfinished. Inspector. Cray sat hunched over the growing mess of notes and interviews, each page connected to another by lines of contradiction. Miss Marple stood by the window, quietly observing the movement of the village beyond the glass. Inside that neat and pleasant community she saw not simplicity but complication, shadows cast by motives too knotted to unravel at a glance. Each suspect had presented a thread of plausibility, but none fit the pattern cleanly. She had always believed that truth behaved like light. Once directed properly, it illuminated everything. But here the beams bent in too many directions. Colin. Price had reason. His housing depended on a lease that, by all accounts, should not have existed. Holloway, by reasserting ownership, threatened to evict him and his nephew. The motive was there, grounded in desperation. But something about Colin's nervousness didn't strike her as that of a killer. His fear felt less like guilt and more like protection, of the boy perhaps, or of something he wasn't yet ready to admit. Then there was Reginald Moore, whose odd placement on Holloway's mantelpiece remained unexplained. Why display a photograph of a man you barely spoke to anymore? If Holloway had suspected Moore of involvement in the lease tampering, it might suggest blackmail or an intended legal confrontation. But the estate agent had been too polished, too confident. His version of the past came out smooth, without hesitation. That rarely meant honesty. Sincerity, in Miss Marple's experience, often arrived with awkward pauses and contradictions. We need more to slip, Cray said. Miss Marple smiled faintly. He already has? The photograph? He blinked. What about it? He claimed he left it accidentally, but it was moved recently, no dust beneath. He placed it there recently, to suggest closeness. But he made the mistake of assuming Holloway had cared enough to display it. A man who displays a photo frames it, dusts it, centers it. Holloway did none of that. Moore planted it. Cray stared at her. Why? To make it seem as though they were still close, to mask suspicion, but only someone who feared being discovered would do something so unnecessary. Now it made sense. Greed cloaked by legality, deception layered over desperation, and through it all, the child's drawing remained the most honest evidence they had. In that sketch, truth had crept out before lies could shut it in. Miss Marple folded her hands, her voice quiet but certain. The web is nearly untangled. We must now watch who struggles hardest when it starts to break. It was late the next afternoon when the results came back from the lab. The blood on the glove matched Henry Holloway's, and the glove itself had traces of red, chalky dust, matching the brick foundation of the old stable behind Brimley Lane. Cray stood at the centre of the station, holding the report like a gavel of justice. To him, the pieces had locked together, the forged lease, the covert payments through Moore's estate channels, the van parked in secrecy, and now physical evidence linking the site to the victim's blood. Moore was brought in before dusk. He was calm, unsurprised even, as though he had prepared for this moment in advance. He didn't deny that the glove was his. He admitted, after a short pause, that he had borrowed the van from his cousins. Business. "I was moving some old furniture for my aunt," he explained smoothly. "No connection to Holloway. That glove must have been left in the van from a previous job. The blood, well, I can't explain that." Cray pressed him harder, but Moore remained maddeningly measured. He didn't panic, didn't contradict himself. His story was conveniently incomplete, just enough to fit into the framework the police wanted. And soon enough, Cray made the call to hold him. News passed quickly through the village. The estate agent had been arrested. The community breathed easier, as if the act of putting someone behind bars had banished the violence from their gentle world. Miss Marple, however, remained seated in her armchair by the fire that evening, her knitting motionless in her lap. She had spoken very little during the interrogation. Moore's answers were technically correct. He had borrowed the van. He had entered Holloway's home in the past for business. But the arrest had arrived not with satisfaction, but with an itch at the back of her mind. Something subtle had shifted. The ease of it. The way Moore had accepted the accusation like a coat he knew how to wear. And the photograph. That unnecessary touch still lingered in her thoughts. By the next morning, Inspector Cray looked nearly triumphant. He informed her that Moore would be transferred to county custody. "There's enough to make it stick," he said. "We've tied him to the crime scene, the payments, and now the murder weapon's disposal location. It lines up." "And yet," Miss Marple said gently, "there's one thing you haven't accounted for." Cray blinked. "Which is?" "Why? Would Moore kill Holloway before the property transfer could benefit him? A forged lease is only useful if the forger remains unnoticed. By killing Holloway, Moore risked exposure." Cray hesitated. Maybe he panicked. She gave a faint smile. "Moore doesn't strike me as a man who panics. He strikes me as someone who prepares, someone who plants photographs, someone who expects investigations. He wanted to seem involved, but only up to a point." Cray frowned. "You think he's covering for someone? Or he's the perfect decoy," she said. "One with just enough guilt to be noticed, but not enough to explain the entire crime. The real culprit let him take the fall." The inspector didn't speak for a long moment. He stared at the glove again, as though it might now say something new. Meanwhile, Miss Marple asked to visit Danny once more. The boy was quiet that morning, sketching shapes in the dirt near the porch. She sat beside him gently. "They say the man who did it has been caught," she said. Danny kept drawing. "But you don't believe that, do you?" He looked up slowly, eyes uncertain. "He wasn't the one in the window." She nodded. "I didn't think so." He pointed with his stick. "The man I saw had a cap, like a driving one. Did Mr. Moore wear a cap?" Danny shook his head. "This one was bigger, like Uncle's." Miss Marple's breath caught. "Did your uncle ever go inside Mr. Holloway's house?" Danny nodded. "He said Mr. Holloway made a mistake. He was going to help fix it. That evening she returned to Holloway's cottage. With Cray's quiet permission, she reviewed the old solicitor's journals, tucked away in the desk drawers. They were sparse, tidy records of minor financial dealings. But one entry caught her eye. It was dated 2 days before his death. "Met with Colin P. again. Reluctant but not dishonest. Suspects forgery but unaware. Must trace signature source discreetly. Reginald's accounts to be investigated quietly. Child may have seen something. Proceed cautiously." Miss Marple's mouth thinned. The victim himself had sensed the tangle. He knew Colin wasn't lying, and he'd mentioned the child. Somehow, Henry Holloway had realized that Danny had seen something he shouldn't have. Perhaps Colin had come clean, or perhaps Holloway had offered to clear the forgery quietly, to spare the boy and keep the peace. But someone else had found out. Someone who couldn't afford discretion. The next morning, Miss Marple walked to the stables behind Brimley Lane once again. The van was still gone, but she peered around the grounds more carefully. Behind a plank of rotting wood near the rear shed, she saw it. An oil-stained rag. On it, the faint imprint of a letterhead. The ink had bled, but she could just make out the tail end of a company name. Blythe. She brought it back to Cray. This, she said, was likely used to wipe the murder weapon, but not by Moore. He'd have burned it or dumped it. This was hurriedly shoved behind wood. Someone not used to covering evidence. Cray stared at it, jaw tight. Then, who? She spoke softly. Who had access to the van? Who wore that cap? Who brought the boy into the village to see Holloway in the first place? Who needed the lease to feel real because they believed it was? Cray's face shifted. The next day, Colin Price was questioned again. This time, Miss Marple came in with Danny. The boy said nothing, just watched his uncle quietly. Colin looked between them, then dropped his gaze. I didn't kill him, he said. I just went to ask for help. I didn't know it was fake. I believed the lease was real. He said he'd try to help us. I left that night. Miss Marple nodded, but someone else followed. Cray leaned forward. Who, Mr. Price? Colin hesitated, then whispered. His cousin, Daniel, works at the haulage firm. He was angry. Said Holloway was ruining everything. Said if he ruined Reggie, he'd ruin us too. Why didn't you say this earlier? He told me to keep quiet. Said Danny would lose his home if I didn't. Miss Marple gently placed a hand on his shoulder. That was the second lie you believed, but not the last. Cray rose. The case wasn't closed. Not yet. A man had been arrested, but he wasn't the killer. The real one had moved in shadows, let another fall, and now they had a name. And the next move would not be his, it would be theirs. The name Colin whispered, Daniel Blythe, sent a quiet ripple through the case. Not because anyone had suspected him, but because no one had thought to. Daniel Blythe, cousin to Reginald Moore, rarely appeared in village affairs. He worked for the family haulage business based in Basingfield and only visited Little Brimley when business demanded it. The name appeared innocuously in transport logs, delivery schedules, and occasionally on the side of the red vans that skirted the edges of the village. But now, that subtle presence began to loom large. And as Miss Marple often said, sometimes it's the quietest names that echo loudest in the end. Inspector Cray dug into Blythe's movements and found something strange. On the night of Holloway's death, Daniel Blythe had signed off a freight log in Basingfield at 10:17 p.m. He'd claimed to be headed west, but CCTV from the Brimley petrol station showed his van parked just after 1 a.m. The same Redbird logo on the side, the same number plate. He was nowhere near where he claimed. The alibi crumbled before anyone had even asked him a question. Still, it was motive they needed. Proof that he wasn't simply visiting or passing through. Miss Marple spent the evening leafing through older files from Holloway's law archive, quietly left to her by Cray once he saw her gift for finding relevance in the forgotten. It was in a faded manila folder, dated 15 years earlier, that she found something that stopped her hands. Blythe Haulage versus Arkwright Construction, dispute over storage contract breach. The name Daniel Blythe appeared 3 times. In the notes, he was marked as the junior partner who had misplaced legal documents and caused the firm a 5-figure settlement loss. That same case had been handled quietly by Holloway himself, then still a practicing solicitor. The file included typed correspondence, some of it particularly sharp. In one note, Holloway had written, "If your cousin continues this deception, I will have no choice but to escalate it beyond a civil matter." Daniel Blythe, then in his early 30s, had faded from any future dealings. No further legal mention of him appeared in Holloway's records after that case. Until now. Miss Marple closed the folder softly, fingers resting on the brittle paper. It wasn't just about property fraud or a forged lease. It was revenge, delayed, suppressed, slowly cultivated and then enacted with precision, cloaked in the convenience of another man's crime. Moore may have been the financial actor, but it was Daniel who had buried the grudge. She took this to Cray the next morning. He stood at the station window, silent, as she laid out the pages, the patterns, the names. Holloway ruined him once, she said, and this time he saw another chance to destroy everything Daniel and Moore had been trying to build. Colin was just a pawn. Moore was the useful target. But Daniel... He waited. Cray's eyes narrowed. He used the van to mislead us, wiped the murder weapon, let Moore hang by omission, even threatened Colin if he spoke, and frightened the boy, Miss Marple said quietly, but not enough. They brought Daniel Blythe in 2 hours later. His face gave nothing away, square-jawed, efficient, every word measured. At first he denied everything. He hadn't been in Little Brimley that night, hadn't spoken to Holloway in over a decade, hadn't even known the man was still alive. Cray laid out the footage. The petrol station timestamp. The van's path. Then the rag with the smeared letterhead. The blood trace. Still, Daniel's story barely shifted. He hadn't cleaned up after any crime. The van had been borrowed. The glove? Maybe Moore's. Maybe someone else's. The denial stood until Miss Marple stepped forward and held out a folded document. "I thought you might want to explain this," she said gently. He looked down. It was the original lease forged in Collins. Name, but on the reverse, faint pencil notations had been scrawled, barely legible. One of them read, "H.H. Mustn't see the other one. C won't question if it looks right." Daniel blinked. "That proves nothing." "It proves," she said softly, "that you intended deception, and that you involved a man who trusted you, who had no idea he was being made a front." Daniel's silence stretched longer now, and then he exhaled, low and tired, as though the effort of carrying the lie had finally begun to press inward. "He had it coming," he said at last. "He made me take the fall years ago. One misfiled contract and he smeared me. My name, my business, nearly ruined. Do you know how long I worked to get back? And then I find out he's holding papers that could undo everything, that he's sniffing around again, calling accounts, talking about court. He said he'd give Colin the house back and then report me for fraud. I couldn't let him do it again." "And more?" Cray asked. "He didn't know," Daniel said. "Not about the murder. He helped with the lease, yes, but I made it look like I'd cover it all, keep everything quiet. I told him Holloway agreed. By the time the old man turned up dead, Moore panicked, and I let him." "You used everyone," Cray said. "I used what was there," Daniel muttered. "They were all playing their parts. I just finished the game. But games, Miss Marple knew, never truly ended that easily, especially when children were involved, especially when someone had watched from behind birch trees with eyes too young to forget. And it had been that innocence, unaccounted for, unguarded, that had unravelled everything. Daniel Blythe was formally arrested that evening. Moore, shaken, was released with a warning and likely charges pending on lesser fraud. Colin Price, though broken by guilt, was cleared. Danny said nothing for a long time, just held his uncle's hand and stared ahead. As Miss Marple walked home, the autumn air had turned sharp, but the weight in her chest had lifted. Crimes, she thought, often began in the past, buried under time, beneath resentment and old paperwork, and sometimes only the smallest eyes could see clearly what the cleverest adults missed. The confession from Daniel Blythe should have felt like an ending. But for Miss Marple, it was merely the lifting of a veil. A truth had been uncovered, yes, but the manner of it, the circumstances, and the quiet manipulation that ran beneath every word Daniel had spoken still left something unresolved. It wasn't about the conviction anymore, it was about certainty. Something still didn't sit right. She had lived long enough to know when guilt came naturally, and when it was worn like borrowed clothes. And Daniel, for all his cold precision, had sounded like a man rehearsing, not resisting, not remorseful, just performing. 2 days after his arrest, Miss Marple sat with Inspector Cray in his office, both of them staring down at the official reports, the statements, the forensic summaries, the arrest warrant. It was all tight, legally sound. But she tapped her finger on the confession again. "Too easy," she said. "Too clean." Cray sighed. "We've got his motive. We've got his timeline. We've got evidence tying him to the scene. And yet no one saw him," she said. "Not a single person, not even Danny. He described a cap, yes, but never the face, not clearly." "Danny was scared," Cray reminded her. "Children may be scared," she said gently, "but they don't invent shadows. They draw what they see. And I believe Danny saw someone he wasn't meant to, but it wasn't Daniel, not directly." Cray raised an eyebrow. "Then what do you think happened?" "I think Daniel took the blame to protect someone else." Cray stared at her. "Who?" "I don't know yet, but I think I can find out, with a little help." That evening, Miss Marple made her way to Colin Price's cottage. Danny was asleep in his room, and Colin sat hunched over a chipped kitchen table, tea cooling beside him. He looked tired, defeated, but not afraid anymore. "I need a favor," she said. He blinked. "From me?" "From Danny. I don't want him dragged through any more of this." "No dragging," she promised, "only drawing." The next morning, she returned with a blank sheet of paper, some coloured pencils, and a soft voice. "Danny," she said, "you've been very brave, and I want to ask for one more thing. Can you draw the man you saw again? But this time, don't draw him from far away. Draw him how he looked when he turned around." Danny hesitated. "But I didn't see his face." "You didn't?" she asked softly. He shook his head. "He had something, in front, like a scarf, and he didn't look up, only down." Miss Marple's fingers stilled. "A scarf?" Danny nodded. "Red. I remember the colour, bright. That wasn't something Daniel Blythe would have worn. Not his style. Too eye-catching, too impulsive. But someone else had been at the scene. Someone who hadn't been questioned thoroughly. Someone who had access to the van, to the glove, to the route, and to the idea of misdirection. She returned to Cray immediately. "Daniel's cousin isn't the only Blythe in that firm," she said. "What about Marcus Blythe?" "The younger brother?" "Yes," she replied. "The one with the temper. The one who's handled the rural routes for years and was reprimanded twice for cutting corners." Cray narrowed his eyes. "He was on our peripheral list, but Daniel didn't mention him, and we had nothing to tie him in. Except a red scarf," she said, "and a face Danny couldn't see." That afternoon, Cray called Marcus in under the pretext of a formal interview regarding delivery times and van access. Miss Marple observed quietly from the corner of the room, knitting in hand, while Marcus shifted in the chair with the vague arrogance of someone unused to consequences. Cray started mildly, asked about van records, routine procedures, where he had been the week Holloway died. Marcus gave precise, firm answers. He knew the script. But Miss Marple watched the twitch in his left hand, the way his thumb tapped twice on the table before every answer. A rhythm. Nervousness masked as routine. After 15 minutes, Cray laid down the bait. "You know, of course, about Daniel's confession." Marcus gave a sharp nod. "He told me, said it was all him." "And you believe him?" Marcus looked briefly caught off guard, then nodded again. "He said he had a reason." "And yet," Cray said, "the child didn't see Daniel's face." Marcus shrugged. "Kids get confused." Miss Marple leaned forward then, her voice soft, measured. "May I ask one question, Inspector?" Cray nodded. She turned to Marcus. "Do you still wear that red scarf? The one with the jagged edge on the bottom?" Marcus blinked. What?" "I saw you in it once, just before winter last year. It stood out. It was distinctive. Danny described it too." Marcus opened his mouth, then closed it. "Red is a hard color to forget," she said, "even for a frightened child. Lots of people wear red scarves, but not many with a tear along the hem," she said gently. "Did you think wiping the blood off your glove with that same scarf wouldn't leave fibers behind?" He froze. Cray sat forward now. "We didn't mention the scarf being used to wipe anything, Marcus." Marcus's mouth opened, no words coming out. "That was an assumption," Cray said slowly, "unless you were there." Marcus stood abruptly, knocking the chair back. "He told me he'd fix it. He said we'd be fine. But then Holloway started nosing around. Daniel said it would ruin everything. I thought he was always protecting the family. I thought—" Miss Marple's voice was calm, but firm. "So you took the van, you waited, you went in with a scarf around your face, and you struck him, then left before anyone saw." "I just wanted to scare him," Marcus whispered. "But he didn't even fight back. He just looked at me, like I was nothing." Cray moved to restrain him as he slumped back into the chair. Daniel had taken the fall to protect his brother. The false confession had been a calculated exchange. He'd assumed they wouldn't find the rest. And without the child's specific observation, something so small, so seemingly irrelevant, they might not have. Outside the station, dusk was falling. Miss Marple stepped into the evening air, the faint scent of smoke drifting from chimneys along the lane. She didn't smile. Not yet. Not until she was sure Danny could sleep without seeing that figure in red. Not until the last shadow had been pulled from the edges of the case. Unconventional as it was, a child's drawing, a torn scarf, and a misplaced assumption had exposed the truth. and as she turned down the familiar path toward home, she thought, not for the first time, that justice was rarely loud. Often it arrived quietly, in pencil lines and glances, waiting for someone who remembered what others had dismissed. The following morning brought a sharp wind through Little Brimley, snapping the trees into motion and dragging loose leaves across the roads like paper chased by breath. Miss Marple stood by her window, watching as the sky turned a brittle grey. Inside the police station, Marcus Blythe had been moved to a holding cell while the charges were prepared. His confession, messy and tear-filled, had been recorded in full. The red scarf had been seized. Plans were underway to retrieve Holloway's remaining legal documents for full analysis. For once, things appeared to be moving forward without obstruction. But certainty has a strange way of unraveling just when it feels secure. Inspector Cray rang Miss Marple just before noon, his voice tight. "We have a problem," he said. "I need you at the station, now." When she arrived, Cray was standing beside a shattered evidence locker. A jagged gap in the glass pane yawned, open where the evidence from Holloway's study had been kept under temporary lock. Holloway's journals, the forged lease with pencil markings, the scarf and the oil-stained rag from behind the stables, all gone. Cray's voice was low. "Someone broke in during the night, disabled the outer alarm. We think it happened between 2 and 4 a.m. Nothing else was touched, just that locker." Miss Marple stared at the emptiness in the cabinet. It was almost surgical in its precision. "This wasn't random," she murmured. "This was targeted." Cray nodded grimly. "We're checking the logs, but so far, no sign of forced entry. And only 3 people had the key to the main door. Myself, Sergeant Langley, and Officer Prentice. Could it have been copied?" she asked. "Possibly. But the code for the locker was changed 2 days ago, after Daniel's arrest. Only I knew it." Miss Marple turned away from the cabinet and looked toward the frosted window. "Then someone close to the case, very close, wanted this buried." That afternoon, interviews were conducted quietly. Langley and Prentice both insisted they hadn't touched the room. Cray seemed visibly shaken, not only by the breach, but by what it suggested, that someone within the station, or with deep access to it, had acted deliberately. Marcus Blythe, meanwhile, denied all knowledge of the theft. He seemed genuinely confused, insisting that once he confessed, he had no reason to cover anything up. "I told you what I did," he said. "It was stupid, and I panicked. But I didn't come back. I don't even know what was taken." But Miss Marple wasn't looking for the person who panicked. She was looking for the person who stayed calm. And there was one name that hadn't come up again since Marcus's arrest: Reginald Moore. The estate agent had been quiet, almost too quiet, during the recent developments. He'd slunk back into his office, making no statements, offering no complaints, and attending no community events. Miss Marple paid him a visit just before sunset. He opened the door with a wary smile. "Miss Marple," he said with forced cheer, "to what do I owe the pleasure?" "I thought you might like to know that someone's stolen the documents linking Daniel and Marcus to the murder," she said. Plainly, Moore's smile faltered. "Stolen? From where?" "The police station," he blinked. "How awful. You sound unsurprised." "I'm not. Not in a case like this. Tempers, motives, it's all tangled." She stepped inside without waiting to be invited, her eyes scanning the room. "You were very quick to let Daniel take the fall," she said, "and even quicker to disappear after Marcus confessed." "I wonder why." Moore's tone cooled. "Because I had no part in it." And yet you benefited. If Holloway had been removed, the property disputes would fade. You could reclaim control, quietly. Daniel takes the blame. Marcus collapses under pressure, and you vanish into the background. I didn't steal anything. No, she said. But you may have hired someone who did. He stared at her for a long moment. Then, with a dismissive breath, turned away. You can't prove anything. No, she agreed. But you're wrong about one thing. What's that? The truth doesn't need to be proven by what's missing, only by what remains. That night, Cray called again. Another report had come in. One of the children at the village school had found a small scrap of paper behind the hedgerow bordering the stable yard. It was torn, soot-marked, but bore part of a signature, Holloway's, and beneath it, the faint outline of the same pencil scratch that had been on the forged lease. It hadn't been taken with the rest. The wind, or perhaps someone clumsy, had left it behind. Miss Marple held it gently the next morning, as if it might disintegrate. They missed a piece, she said. The person who broke in knew what they were looking for, but they didn't understand how Holloway worked. Cray leaned closer. What do you mean? He kept duplicates, she said. Meticulous, quiet, but thorough. He once represented a man in a fraud case where the key to victory was a duplicate invoice. Holloway learned from everything. If he knew someone had forged that lease, he would have made a copy of the real one and hidden it. They searched Holloway's cottage again, this time not just for evidence, but for intention. Behind the fireplace paneling, tucked inside a false baseboard, they found a slender envelope. Inside it, the real lease for Colin Price's cottage, unaltered, legitimate, signed 6 years earlier. And in Holloway's handwriting, a note, for the boy's sake, let him stay. Cray stared at the paper in silence. He was going to protect them. He already had, Miss Marple said. That's why Daniel panicked. That's why Marcus was sent to frighten Holloway, not kill him. But something went wrong, and someone else used the chaos to clean up what they could. Cray nodded. Moore. They brought Reginald Moore in the next day. No charges yet. No dramatic confrontation. Just quiet observation as Miss Marple slid the newly found lease across the table. He stared at it for a long time, then looked up. How did you find it? Because unlike you, she said softly, Holloway thought long-term. He planned for what others dismissed. Moore said nothing, but the stillness in his face, the way his fingers stilled on the edge of the table, Miss Marple saw the crack. He knew it was over. Not because they had the stolen documents, but because the one piece he had missed told the truth more clearly than anything he had tried to erase. Even in vanishing, evidence left its shape behind, and justice, once shaken, had found its footing again. It was barely 2 days after the recovery of Holloway's original lease when the village was rattled once more. This time, there was no mystery in who had died, only in how and why. Marcus Blythe was found dead in his cell at the county station, discovered by a night guard during a routine check. At first glance, it looked like suicide, a crude knot fashioned from a strip of torn bedding slung over the narrow pipe near the ceiling. But something about it felt too calculated, too timely. And when the forensic report arrived, it quietly unraveled the illusion. Ligature marks on the neck were inconsistent with self-infliction. No defensive wounds, no note, and most damning of all, Marcus's cell log showed a blackout in the camera feed for precisely 11 minutes during the early hours of the morning, long enough for someone to get in and out without notice. Miss Marple received the news as she prepared her tea, the radio humming softly in the corner. The moment Cray's voice reached her through the receiver, low and subdued, she knew. Before he said the name, before he explained what had happened, she knew the case was not finished. By the time she arrived at the station, Cray looked less like a man in charge and more like a man trying not to unravel. The sense of order he had clung to, the logic he had trusted, had shifted again beneath his feet. The air around him felt heavier. He was silenced, he said bluntly. Someone wanted to end it before Marcus could speak again. He was starting to ask questions about Daniel, about what came next. He was cracking Jane. And now he's gone. Miss Marple sat quietly across from him, her fingers folded. "You were right to be cautious," she said softly. "This wasn't about protecting a crime anymore. This was about protecting a system, a chain of silence." Cray exhaled sharply. "You think Moore did this?" "I think Moore was the architect of the cover-up," she said. "But he doesn't strike me as someone who'd dirty his hands with violence. Not unless cornered." "Then who?" She hesitated. "You said only 3 people had key access to the building where Marcus was held." Cray blinked. "Yes, myself, Sergeant Langley, and the night officer, Dean Moffat." "Have you spoken with Moffat?" "He's off duty. Claimed he was ill last night. Another officer covered his shift." "That's when it happened." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "Did anyone verify that claim?" "No," Cray admitted. "Not yet." She rose. "Then we must. Because either Moffat let someone in, or someone posed as him." They located Moffat that afternoon, at a relative's home on the edge of Basingfield. He looked haggard, pale, startled when he opened the door. Claimed he hadn't been near the station. Claimed he'd been in bed with a fever. No visitors, no contact. But there were no signs of illness. And his boots, caked with dried mud, suggested he had, in fact, been out. Miss Marple noticed the detail as he shifted nervously in the doorway. "We're not accusing you," she said gently. "But if someone used your access, we need to know." His eyes darted, then dropped. "I was there," he murmured. "I just didn't want to get involved." Cray's posture stiffened. "Explain." Moffat swallowed. "Moore called me. Said there'd been a mix-up in evidence. Said he needed to retrieve something Marcus had hidden. Said it was all internal, legal stuff. I didn't ask questions. I let him in. Watched from the desk." "And did you see him leave?" Moffat shook his head. "No, I turned away, just for a minute. When I looked back, he was gone. I checked the cell. Marcus was sitting up. Looked fine. I thought it was done." Miss Marple's expression didn't change. "But someone else came later. He didn't speak, but he didn't deny it." Later that evening, Cray had Moore brought in. This time his facade had slipped. His collar was askew, his tone was brittle. "You've gone too far," Cray said. "Tampering with evidence, breaking into the station, and now complicity in murder." Moore didn't flinch. "I don't know what you're talking about." But Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice soft but firm. "Then allow me to remind you. You knew Marcus would talk. He was frightened, and frightened men tell stories. So you made a call, not to silence him directly, but to arrange his silence. Moore gave a slow, bitter laugh. Do you think I hired someone to kill him? You're giving me too much credit. Not hired, she said. Convinced. You simply said the right thing to the right person. Probably someone inside. Someone loyal. Someone who thought Marcus would ruin what you were building. Which was what exactly? Cray snapped. Moore's voice lowered. Control. Over the estates. Over the assets. Holloway knew too much. Daniel tried to patch it. Marcus made it messy. And I tried to contain it. Cray's voice dropped to a low hiss. You failed. Moore said nothing. But outside the interrogation room, the wind had changed again. Miss Marple stepped into the fading light, hands wrapped around a folded document. The second copy of Holloway's ledger, recovered from behind a false panel in his bookcase. A name circled there, with a payment logged 3 months before the murder. Dean Moffat. An amount too large for anything official, labeled only delivery assistance, night ledger. Quiet hand. She had not shown it to Cray yet, not until she was certain. But now, with Marcus dead, Moore cornered, and the trail still curving away from resolution, she understood what Holloway had been tracking. This wasn't just a cover-up. It was a network, a quiet web of trades and favors, pulling in the weak and ambitious alike. And someone out there, still alive, still watching, was prepared to kill again to keep it buried. The game wasn't over. It had just changed. The next morning arrived with a biting chill and an unfamiliar silence that clung to little Brimley, like mist. The village had grown quieter with each revelation, as if holding its breath, sensing that something unfinished lingered just beneath the surface. Marcus Blythe was dead. Reginald Moore was in custody, but not yet formally charged. And now, through Dean Moffat, the corruption seemed to stretch farther than anyone had dared to imagine. But still, despite the confessions, the tampered records, the threats, the forgery, and the murder, something didn't fit. Miss Marple sat in her front room, Holloway's duplicate ledger resting in her lap. She turned its pages slowly, not looking for new information, but for something she might have overlooked the first time. The handwriting was neat, the margins filled with tidy notes, names, dates, account references. And then, halfway through the second section, she saw it again. A name circled in red pencil. C. Marchant. It hadn't meant anything to her before. Marchant wasn't involved in the estate dealings. He ran the stationery shop at the edge of the village, harmless, overlooked. But now something stirred at the back of her memory. She rose quickly and crossed to the bureau, opening a drawer where she kept small oddments, receipts, scraps of notes. From a few weeks earlier, she retrieved the receipt for a parcel she'd sent to her niece, bought at Marchant's shop. The bottom, faint and barely legible, was a small printed notice, now offering document duplication and private lamination services. Discreet, no questions asked. She blinked. The phrase felt strange, out of place for something as simple as a stationery shop. Within the hour she was walking briskly down the lane, the receipt folded in her pocket. The bell above the door to Marchant's shop jingled softly as she entered. Inside, the man himself stood behind the counter, thinning hair, cardigan too tight at the sleeves, spectacles perched low on his nose. "Miss Marple," he greeted with a polite nod. "Haven't seen you in a while." "I don't usually laminate things," she replied gently, her eyes drifting across the countertop to a set of blank carbon sheets and a neatly stacked pile of plastic covers. Though I hear you've expanded your services. Marchant gave a small, uncomfortable smile. Little side business. Some of the local estate workers use it. Privacy's important with documents. I imagine it is, she said. Especially for people who don't want their names tied to certain papers. You wouldn't happen to keep a record of what's copied, would you? He hesitated, then shook his head. It's not my policy. No, she said, but I suspect Holloway thought it might become someone else's policy, which is why he listed your name, Mr. Marchant, because you saw what he was investigating. Marchant's throat bobbed. He stepped back slightly. I don't know what you... You copied the forged lease, she said. Not the original, but the altered one. Someone brought it in, asked for a clean duplicate, and you obliged. You probably thought it was harmless. But Holloway traced the ink. That's how he knew the lease hadn't been typed by his machine. And you were the only person in the village with the equipment to do that. He blinked rapidly, breath-catching. It was Reginald Moore, he whispered. Came in after hours, said it was for a client, had the papers already half-altered. I didn't ask questions. I didn't know it was part of a scam. I just made a copy. He paid cash. Did he come alone? Marchant paused. No, a woman was with him. Blonde, young, not from here, didn't speak much. Miss Marple's chest tightened. A woman. That hadn't been part of the story before. She left Marchant's shop quickly and made her way back to Cray, relaying the detail. He listened, frowning deeper with every word. She could have been the one who went into Marcus's cell, Cray said. If Moffat was distracted, if he thought it was someone harmless. She wasn't harmless, Miss Marple said. She was invisible, because none of us were looking for her. Cray stood, turning to the board behind him. Photographs, names, timelines. He stared at them again, then pulled one down, a blurry image from the petrol station CCTV taken the night of the murder. Moore's van, just after 1 a.m., and beside it, a figure stepping down from the passenger side. Not clearly visible, but slim. Slight. Long hair visible in the reflection. She was with him then too, Cray murmured. She was the one who took the evidence, Miss Marple added. Moore may have planned it, but she executed it. Cray's jaw tightened. We have no ID, no name. No official records of Moore working with a woman on any legal cases. No clients matching that description. Because she wasn't a client, Miss Marple said softly. She was the cleaner, the one who swept the board after the first piece was moved. Cray looked at her. You're saying she's the one orchestrating this now? I believe she's the one who's made sure the pattern never links, she replied. The one tying the ends before they can fray. Cray sat down, absorbing the weight of it. So we're chasing a ghost. No, Miss Marple said, folding her hands. We're chasing a habit. Cray blinked. Come again? Moore, Blythe, Marchant, even Moffat. They all have patterns, quiet routines, but she, whoever she is, appears only when she needs to. And disappears just as quickly. She doesn't leave patterns, but she leaves habits, habits of others. She uses them. Cray straightened. So what do we look for? The next habit she can exploit, she said. Who's left? Who still has access to documents? Who still thinks they're just helping? Who could she use next? Cray turned back to the board. The list of names grew shorter. But the shape of something larger was finally starting to form. Not just a crime, but a structure. a method, one that had lived among them, undetected, by never acting the same way twice. Miss Marple's voice was calm. We thought Holloway's murder was the beginning, but it wasn't. It was the first time someone resisted the pattern, and that's why they killed him. Cray looked at her, understanding dawning slowly. The real threat wasn't the murderer who'd panicked. It was the one who never had to. The name still hadn't surfaced. The woman with the blonde hair remained untraceable, unmentioned in every statement, and unseen in any official record. But her presence now cast a shadow across every part of the case. She had been at the petrol station with Moore. She had been with him when the forged lease was copied. And she had almost certainly been involved in the break-in at the station, perhaps even Marcus's murder. The more they uncovered, the more it became clear that while Moore, Daniel, and Marcus had orchestrated pieces of the crime, none of them had truly controlled it. Someone else had been steering them, quietly, expertly from behind the curtain. Miss Marple returned to Holloway's files that evening. Cray had allowed her to take the duplicate ledger home, and she now read it not as a record of transactions, but as a portrait of a man who had sensed what others missed. Holloway's mind had been sharp, yes, but not paranoid. He didn't scribble accusations or speculate wildly. Instead, he wrote things plainly. Dates, changes in behavior, names that reappeared too frequently. It was in one of those entries, buried between routine lease notes, that Miss Marple found it. A line that read, "Tenant requested change in delivery access, insisted on anonymity, paid above rate, connected to M." The tenant in question was in a property Holloway didn't own directly, but had once brokered, as a favor to an old client. The initials matched no one on their official suspect list, but the payment had come from a trust, EM Solutions. She made her way to Cray's office at once. "Find the trust," she said simply, laying the page before him. "EM Solutions, and see who has access to its accounts." By morning they had an answer. The trust belonged to a woman named Elise Morgan. No known address. No listed occupation. But the trust had transferred funds to Moore's firm multiple times under client confidentiality clauses. The name rang no bells until Cray stumbled upon a court document from 7 years prior. Elise Morgan had once filed a civil case against a company Holloway had defended, a case she'd lost. She had claimed emotional distress, financial harm, and defamation. The court had dismissed it for lack of evidence. The company in question, Blythe Haulage. Miss Marple sat back in her chair, absorbing the shape of it. Elise Morgan hadn't just emerged from nowhere. She'd been circling this group for years. Her case dismissed, her accusations ignored, and those same men, Moore, Daniel, Marcus, had either benefited from her silence or contributed to it. And when Holloway took up the thread again, poking around the same names and same structures, Elise must have seen her moment not only to retaliate, but to control. This was never just about money, Miss Marple said quietly. Not even about erasing evidence. It was about making them useful. She turned them into instruments of her own revenge. Cray nodded, slow and grim. She didn't want them gone. She wanted them compliant. She manipulated Daniel with guilt, used Moore's greed, exploited Marcus's recklessness, and with each of them she got what she wanted. But Holloway wouldn't bend, Cray said. No, Miss Marple replied. He did what no one else did. He asked the why. and he planned to expose her through the only means she couldn't manipulate, truth recorded in his own words. Which is why she had to stop him. Permanently. Cray stood and walked to the map pinned to his wall. Elise had no address, no workplace. But her name existed now, and with it came a trail, small but real. They traced a rented flat in Croydon linked to her name, but by the time officers arrived, it was empty. No fingerprints, no electronics. Only a stack of worn magazines about financial corruption and whistleblowing cases. As if she had been studying the patterns of those who had failed, planning how to avoid their mistakes. But in every room she had touched, Elise had left one constant: control. She had built her revenge on the failure of systems to hear her. She had rebuilt herself around the idea that if she couldn't find justice, she would make her own, and if that meant using men like Moore and Blythe as pawns, then so be it. She had watched them walk away from consequences and chosen not to confront them, but to own them. Miss Marple and Cray sat in silence for a time, letting the weight of it settle. She saw herself as righteous, Cray said. Not a villain. Not a killer. She believed she was balancing the scale, Miss Marple murmured. That they took something from her, and she was only redistributing the cost. But Marcus died, Cray said. She never planned for that. She said she wanted control, not chaos, but Marcus cracked under pressure, and she couldn't risk that, so she killed him. I think she watched it happen, or allowed it to, that's worse. Cray exhaled. She's still ahead of us. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Yes, but she's not invisible anymore, she's seen. And once people like her are seen, they start to falter. Because they only ever held power through silence. Cray turned away from the window, his expression sharper now. We'll find her. Miss Marple nodded once. And when you do, don't expect rage. Expect calculation. She'll make it sound reasonable, justified. But underneath that will be something far older than logic. Hurt. Humiliation. The sense that no one listened until it was too late. Cray asked softly, Do you pity her? Miss Marple didn't answer at first. Then, folding Holloway's notebook in her hands, she said, I pity the girl she was before all this began, but not the woman she became. They both stood in silence. A case once believed to be about forged leases, hidden funds, and family ties had revealed itself to be far more personal. It was about a mind cut off from redress, shaped by rejection, and fueled by the cold certainty that if the world wouldn't make space for her story, she would write it herself, line by line, in other people's names, until the silence cracked. Now, the crack was wide open, and Elise Morgan was somewhere out there, watching, but no longer unseen. It was nearing dusk when the plan began to take shape, not a trap in the dramatic sense, but a careful arrangement of truth, routine, and the smallest crack in human behavior. Miss Marple had always believed that the most elusive people were not those who disappeared entirely, but those who lingered just enough to believe they hadn't been seen. Elise Morgan had been seen now, and it would be her habit, not her fear, that would bring her to the surface. They knew she wouldn't stay still for long. Her network was dissolving. Moore was in custody, his accounts frozen. Daniel Blythe was under round-the-clock surveillance, reduced to a bitter silence. And Moffat, still under questioning, had grown visibly frayed, now aware that his choices would never disappear. Elise had worked through them all, weaving herself between their ambitions and fears, but now the threads were fraying. Sooner or later she would need something to reassert control, another transaction, another message, another meeting. Miss Marple proposed they give her one. A fake document was drawn up, a final lease agreement tied to one of Holloway's disputed properties, carrying enough weight to seem valuable but false enough to be obvious to someone truly informed. It was supposedly being delivered to Cray's office for final verification. They made certain the message was leaked to Moore, slipped through one of the few sympathetic ears left, a man who still thought Moore might help him keep his job. Then they waited. The document sat locked in Cray's drawer, not a real key among them. It was monitored, time-stamped, placed under silent watch. At first, hours passed with nothing. Then, just past 2 in the morning, the exterior camera outside the station flickered once, briefly, before going dark. Inside, the motion sensor in the hallway caught the faint shape of a woman, her steps swift and assured. She didn't wear a mask. She didn't hesitate. She moved with the ease of someone who had done this before. Cray and Miss Marple waited in the small interview room across the corridor, lights off. Elise didn't head to the cell blocks, didn't glance at the archive shelves. She moved directly to the desk where the decoy document had been planted. She picked the lock in seconds, removed the folder, opened it, and froze. Cray stepped into the hallway with quiet authority. "It's a forgery," he said. Elise didn't turn. "It doesn't exist. That lease, that transaction, none of it." Still, she didn't move. She simply stared at the pages, eyes tracing over the familiar language. "You knew Holloway would catch you eventually," Miss Marple said softly, stepping into view. "That's why you had to keep adjusting. The scarf, the forgery, the stolen ledger, the missing evidence. But he always wrote things down. And that's what ruined it in the end, Elise. You couldn't control what he wrote, only what others saw." She turned then, slowly. The same face from the grainy footage, the same calm presence that Marchant had described. But there was no panic in her expression, only an eerie composure. "I never meant for it to get this far," she said. "It was never meant to end in death." Miss Marple's voice remained steady. "But it did. He would have taken it all," Elise said, her voice low. "After everything, after they humiliated me, used me, left me to crawl through court filings and charity services and the unlisted corners of public records, they would have kept their houses, their money, their respect, and I would have had what? A file marked dismissed. He was going to preserve them again, just like before." "So you created your own system," Cray said, "one where you could play judge." "I didn't create anything," she snapped, the first hint of heat in her voice. "I inherited the mess. I just learned how to survive it." Miss Marple stepped forward. "Then why come tonight? Why steal a piece of paper if your work was already done?" Elise looked at her, the stillness returning. "Because I wanted to be sure that there was nothing left of him in the record." "But there was," Miss Marple said gently. "There always is. Not in the documents, in the people." For the first time, Elise looked away. Her shoulders sank slightly, the tension slipping from her arms. "You know what frightens me the most?" she said almost to herself. "It's not prison. It's the idea that none of it mattered, that I pulled the string and nothing changed." Cray didn't respond. He only stepped forward, motioned to the officers waiting quietly at the door. Elise didn't fight. She handed over the file, straightened her coat, and allowed them to guide her from the room. Later, when the corridor had emptied, and silence returned to the station, Miss Marple stood at the window overlooking the main street. The lamps glowed faintly through the fog, and the village, even now, looked untouched by what had unfolded inside it. Cray joined her. "You were right. It was never about the leases." "No," she said. "It was about being heard. And when that failed, being obeyed. She almost got away with it. She nearly convinced herself she already had." Cray looked at her. "You knew she'd come tonight." "I hoped," Miss Marple said softly. "Because people like Elise, those who lose their voice, they don't disappear. They linger. They try again. But when the lies fall apart, they come back, not for power, for confirmation that it wasn't all for nothing." Cray nodded slowly, then turned toward the hallway, where the file still lay on the table, untouched, unopened now, but no longer blank. It had served its purpose. It had drawn out the last voice still whispering behind the curtain. Miss Marple didn't smile. She rarely did at the end. Not when the truth revealed not just what people had done, but why they felt they had no other choice. The case was closed, but the echo of its cause would stay with them. Some crimes leave no fingerprints. Only footprints in the softest places: pride, shame, silence. And now, at last, they had been seen. Rain drifted in thin sheets against the window panes of Little Brimley's police station, the kind that tapped gently as though hesitant to interrupt the stillness. Elise Morgan had been transferred to a secure facility that morning, and the village was beginning to exhale. Cray had called it the longest case he'd handled since joining the force, and Miss Marple, while never one to bask in victory, allowed herself a few quiet moments that afternoon to tidy the final notes in her ledger. The chain of events had been ugly, convoluted, and tragic, but the pattern had been followed to its end, or so they thought. It was just past 5 when the call came in, not through the station, but to Miss Marple's own telephone, the rotary humming with each turn of her fingers as she answered. The voice on the other end was breathless. Geraldine, the housekeeper who had found Henry Holloway's body, was weeping. "It's the cellar," she said. "I never thought to check. There's something down there. I don't know what it means, but you need to come." Miss Marple arrived before the constable did. The Holloway cottage had long since been released back to Geraldine's care, and she had returned to tidy the belongings to prepare for the estate review. But the cellar, always locked, rarely used, had remained untouched. It wasn't until she moved an old box of ledgers that she noticed the slanted wooden hatch beneath the rug. The padlock was rusted but recently broken, as though someone had forced it weeks earlier. Miss Marple descended the narrow steps carefully, the air damp and stale. What lay below was not what she had expected, not boxes, not wine, but a low wooden table, a chair, and dozens of files, neatly sorted, meticulously labelled, names, dates, payments, and more, photographs, typed transcripts of private meetings, receipts from both official and discreet exchanges. It wasn't just Holloway's personal archive, it was a mirror of the very network Elise Morgan had tried to expose. Cray arrived minutes later, flashlight in hand. Together they combed through the papers, and the unease returned, as if the air had thickened with every uncovered folder. But then, Beneath the bottom stack, they found it. A sealed envelope labelled in Holloway's firm, square hand. In case of disappearance or sudden death. Cray opened it, eyes scanning quickly. Then he looked at Miss Marple, the colour draining from his face. "It wasn't Elise," he said. "At least, not entirely." The letter inside wasn't an accusation. It was a warning. Holloway had known something long before Elise resurfaced. The real orchestrator, the one who had exploited Elise's bitterness, who had quietly fed her the documents, directed her efforts, and positioned her in every key moment, was someone even closer. The name written at the bottom of the letter was Colin Price. Miss Marple stood in silence, not disbelief, just a dawning sense that the case had never been what anyone assumed. Colin, the grieving uncle, the man with the tattered coat and the tired eyes, the one who had been used, everyone thought, as a pawn. But Holloway's words were precise. He's not who he claims to be. His real name is Colin Marston. He served 3 years under a suspended license after misappropriating client funds. He came to Brimley under a false name and arranged to rent the cottage using a manipulated lease. He found Elise shortly after. Together, they began to dismantle the records, but Elise believed she was working alone. She wasn't. He was feeding her what to destroy. Cray whispered it aloud as if afraid the walls would hear. He used her. He gave her purpose, Miss Marple said softly, and let her take the blame. They moved quickly. The constables were dispatched to the cottage, but it was empty, the bed unslept in, Danny gone. Miss Marple stood in the hallway scanning the mantelpiece. The drawing Danny had made all those weeks ago still hung there, slightly curled at the edges. The stick figure, the red crayon. But now she noticed what she hadn't seen before. There were 2 figures beside the body, not one. 2 silhouettes. One standing over Holloway with a club, the other watching from the doorway. She hadn't asked about the second figure. Cray found the first lead in a purchase made under Colin's real name at a railway station 20 miles away. 2 tickets, 1 adult, 1 child. Destination, Dover. "I'll go," he said. "We might still catch them." Miss Marple shook her head. "He won't go to Dover. That was planted. A false trail. He wants you looking in the wrong direction." Cray paused. "Then where?" She stared at the drawing again. The trees behind the figures. Not birch, willow. Holloway's own garden had none. But the old railway bridge east of town had 3 weeping willows clustered along the embankment, and a path beside it that led nowhere but a forgotten orchard. Danny had been drawing from that angle. "He's going to burn the rest," Miss Marple said. "Whatever files Elise didn't know about. That's why he went back. And he's taking the boy, not to escape, to bury the evidence, and the witness." They reached the orchard just after twilight. Smoke curled through the trees, low and bitter. Cray moved first, flashlight swinging. In the clearing ahead stood Colin, sleeves rolled, a small fire at his feet. Danny sat on a rock nearby, hands folded, eyes vacant. Cray shouted, "Step away!" Colin turned slowly, hands visible, face calm. "You don't understand," he said. "It was all wrong from the beginning. They were corrupt, all of them. I only wanted justice." Miss Marple stepped closer. "But you didn't find it. You controlled it." "I gave her the power to fight," he said, gesturing at the fire. "Elise was broken. I showed her how to rebuild. Every document she burned, I gave her. Every route she took, I paved. And when she got too close to the edge," Miss Marple said, "you made sure she fell." He didn't respond. Cray took another step forward. "Let the boy go." Colin's voice lowered. "He knows. He saw more than you think. I was going to make it clean." "But you didn't," Miss Marple said. "You made it cruel." For the first time, Colin faltered. Then he dropped the lighter, stepped back from the flame, and raised his hands. They cuffed him on the spot. Danny walked silently to Miss Marple and took her hand. She didn't speak, only squeezed it gently. And in the stillness, the last twist of the story settled into place, not in betrayal or revelation, but in the way the boy looked at the fire, not with fear, but relief, as if something unspoken had finally ended, because sometimes the mastermind isn't the loudest voice. Sometimes he's the one who makes others believe they were never victims, but soldiers in his war. The fire was extinguished within minutes, but its bitter scent clung to the orchard like smoke clings to sorrow. The last of the papers had been saved, half-charred folders pulled from the edges of the flames by Cray's officers. They'd been bundled into evidence bags before the ashes could settle. Colin Marston, still wearing the name Price like a second skin, sat in the back of the police vehicle, wrists bound and expression drained of theatrics. No pleas, no denials, no boasts, just silence. But Miss Marple knew it wasn't defeat. It was calculation, retreating beneath the surface, waiting for another chance. Danny had been taken home. A constable stayed with him, and Miss Marple had made sure he was given warmth, food and rest before she returned to the station with Cray. The boy had said very little during the ride back, except one phrase that repeated softly under his breath. "He said I could be clever too." Miss Marple said nothing in reply, but inside the ache was deep. Manipulation was an art for some, quiet, invisible, and often most effective when disguised as praise. Colin had not struck the boy, had not shouted, but he had twisted the child's trust, shaping his loyalty like soft clay. That was the cruelty, beneath the cleverness, not the crime itself, but the way he'd used innocence to shield it. Back in Cray's office, the recovered files were spread across the desk. The scale of what Colin had constructed was staggering. He had forged more than just leases. He had built an entire history out of falsified identities, altered financials, and misdirected accusations. Elise had been a real person, yes, but she had never been the central architect. She'd been angry, wounded, but she hadn't known the full picture. Colin had found her, fed her half-truths, and guided her rage until it masked his own hands. Even Marcus, clumsy and volatile as he was, had only ever been used for his placement in the family business. It was a conspiracy orchestrated not through violence, but through persuasion. And Miss Marple had known the truth from the moment she realized Colin had returned to Holloway's house after the murder, when no one else had a reason to. That second figure in Danny's drawing had haunted her, a shadow not just present at the scene but staying behind to watch. Only someone with a long game, someone with no panic in his heart, would risk returning to the place where everything had begun, just to clean the trail a little more. Elise had fled. Moore had hidden. Colin had walked right back into the center and waited. Cray rubbed his temple, staring at the wall of evidence. "Do you think the courts will see it for what it is?" "They may," Miss Marple said softly, "but justice is rarely as clear as guilt. You think he'll walk?" "I think," she said, folding one of the statements, "he'll try." It took 3 days for the case to reach the Crown's attention. Colin was officially charged with conspiracy to defraud, obstruction of justice, and accessory to manslaughter. in the death of Henry Holloway. But the charge of murder, the one everyone had waited for, was not included. Not enough to prove it was Colin who struck the fatal blow, not without Holloway's own voice. And so, the case shifted. The trial would be about fraud, about destruction of property and evidence, and about the manipulation of public trust. And as the hearings began, something else happened. Colin's defense team filed a motion for psychological leniency, claiming trauma, pressure, paranoia born from wrongful convictions. They painted a portrait of a man misunderstood, reclusive, desperate for a new beginning. Elise was cast as the unstable one, the fanatic. Colin was the caretaker trying to rein her in, a victim of her downfall, not the cause of it. Miss Marple sat through one of the sessions in the back row, listening to the words like poisoned honey, and when the session ended, she remained seated, waiting until the courtroom had emptied. Cray joined her, eyes downcast. "They're twisting it," he said. "They're reframing it," she corrected. "Not twisting, just bending. Enough to blur the edge. He might serve time," Cray said, "but it won't be justice." "No," she said quietly. "But it will be proof that he was seen, that the truth existed." Cray turned to her. "How did you know? Before the orchard? Before the drawing? Before the second name?" She looked ahead, voice low but unwavering. "Because everything else led outward. Elise, Moore, Marcus. They were all external pressure points. But the moment I saw Danny's drawing, I knew the truth had stayed behind. He drew the murder, not as a moment, but as a scene, with two figures, one active, one passive, and Danny would only have drawn that if the second person wasn't unknown. He saw someone familiar, someone who stayed." "And the ledger?" Cray asked. "Holloway suspected him," she said, "but he knew suspicion wouldn't be enough. That's why he made a duplicate, not just of the lease, but of the person behind it. He was preparing to confront Colin when he died. That's why the cellar files were so important. They weren't evidence, they were a mirror." She stood then slowly. "Colin may walk free one day, but he'll never walk unmarked. Because men like him believe they can rewrite the story, but they always forget the ones who pay attention." Cray watched her go, the echo of her steps fading. Outside, the wind had picked up, and the trees swayed softly along the road. The boy was safe. The woman had been found, the mastermind unmasked. But justice, like truth, had many faces. And sometimes the price of knowing it was only that you carried its weight, long after others had turned away. Miss Marple walked home through the narrow lane of birches, her coat drawn tight and her thoughts quiet. The case was closed, but she would remember every page. The village of Little Brimley settled back into its rhythm slowly, like a clock winding itself after a long pause. The constables no longer stood at corners. Elise Morgan's name faded from whispered gossip. Colin Marston, still called Price by habit, awaited trial in a prison far from the green hedgerows he had quietly corrupted. There was no more smoke curling from the orchard, no more secrets waiting in Holloway's cellar. And yet, despite the calm, something faint still hummed beneath it all, a thread not quite snipped. Miss Marple sat quietly in her parlour, the windows open just enough to let in the scent of trimmed hedges. The day was clear, too quiet for the time of year. Spring had arrived early. Cray had stopped by that morning with a small parcel. Files being officially closed, a personal thanks from the county. She'd accepted it without comment, though the ribbon around the folder remained untouched on her side table. She wasn't ready to tie anything off. She reached for the final copy of Holloway's notebook, the one he had hidden away with such care. Not the ledger of crimes, but a personal journal of sorts. Mostly reflections, fragments of thoughts that never made it into legal filings. She had skimmed it before, but had left the last few pages unread, not out of fear, but because it hadn't felt like time. Now, with the house still and the air unmoving, she turned to them. March 18th. The boy draws what he sees, not what he understands. There's safety in that. But what he saw, someone else was watching him. Not watching the scene, watching him. It wasn't Price. I thought it was Elise, but now I'm not sure. She was always exacting, but someone else was in the room. I can feel it. Something beyond the roles I assumed. Miss Marple stared at the page. The handwriting was more rushed here. The lines slanted, an unusual trait for Holloway. But she could see the weight in them. If I disappear, someone should ask about the visitor from 3 days before, a woman. She didn't give a name, claimed to be from the trust. I never saw her again. But she asked questions she shouldn't have known how to ask. I thought it was about the property. It wasn't. There was no signature, no follow-up entry, just a long ink smudge at the bottom where the pen had trailed off. Miss Marple closed the book softly. No visitor had ever been logged on that day. Cray had reviewed the guest list. Geraldine had remembered. No one unusual. But Holloway was not the sort to imagine things. And if he had written it here, it meant he hadn't told anyone else, either because he hadn't wanted to worry them, or because he feared what that worry would lead to. She rose, slow and thoughtful, and walked to the mantel. Danny's drawing had been placed there now, framed not for decoration, but for remembrance. 2 figures beside a fallen man, and a third, barely etched behind the trees. Miss Marple had assumed it was a mistake, a child's habit of crowding the page. But now she looked again. This figure had no colour, no lines connecting it to the scene, as though Danny had drawn someone outside the moment, watching it, as if he'd glimpsed them once and then lost sight of them. A knock at the door startled her, sharp in the silence. When she opened it, Cray stood with a frown. "I've just come from the regional archives," he said. "We were following up on a detail from Elise's trust history. Something odd came up." She gestured him in. "Sit down. What did you find?" She wasn't the only one who received anonymous payments. Holloway did too, about 2 years ago. A sizable deposit under the name W.H. Carruth. Miss Marple paused. Carruth. We thought it was a client. But Holloway never logged the name. No files, no entries. And the bank couldn't verify the ID tied to the transaction. Fake name, no address, only the payment. To what account? His personal one. Just the once. Then nothing. She thought about it for a moment. Perhaps he was being paid off. Or perhaps being led. "I think it was the second," Cray said quietly. "Because one of the folders Elise tried to burn, that nearly went up in the orchard, was marked Carruth as well. She didn't know it was connected. But Colin did, and he hid it until the end." Miss Marple turned to the notebook again, then walked back to her desk. She opened a drawer and retrieved a thin slip of paper, a receipt, from the railway station. not one of Colin's. One she had found tucked into Holloway's journal. She'd dismissed it as routine, but now she held it up. The name scribbled. On the back was W.H. Carruth. Underneath it, "See me once more. Then we're finished." The date was 2 weeks before Holloway's death. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "It wasn't Elise who delivered the final threat," she said. "It wasn't Colin who paid the first bribe. Someone else set the wheels in motion. Someone not in the circle, but just outside it." Cray straightened. "You think there's another?" "I think," she said, "we haven't turned over the last stone." And just then, the phone rang. Cray stepped toward it instinctively, but Miss Marple shook her head. She lifted the receiver herself, placing it gently to her ear. There was only silence on the other end. Then a low hum of static. A faint voice, not clear, not fully formed, just a breath. And then a whisper. "He drew me wrong." The line went dead. Miss Marple didn't move. She stared at the receiver in her hand, the echo of the voice lingering, like a thread pulled taut. Outside, the wind had risen again, rattling the trees just enough to sound like footsteps. Somewhere, someone had watched the entire story unfold and chosen not to stop it, not out of fear, but patience. She turned to Cray, her voice steady. "The case is over." "But?" he asked. She looked out the window where dusk crept over the hedgerows. "But the story," she said, "is still being written."